person who will introduce our today's speaker, Taras Datlik. He is a Vice Rector for Development and International Cooperation of our Institute, and he is also Director for Vital Sustainability Initiative in Eastern Europe for Scholar Leaders. He is also Theological Education Consultant for MESA Global. Taras, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Ksenia. Thank you, Melody, too. So Melody, she is a board member of the Roma Bible School in Southeastern Europe and Germany, and her research interests include mission, culture, and the gospel, as well as ecotheology and creation care. She has also written extensively on issues related to the Roma people in Central and Eastern Europe, and her first book, Roma Pentecostals Narrating Identity, Trauma and Renewal in Croatia and Serbia, was published in 2023. And please, Dr. Melody, we are ready to listen to your lecture, The Other Displaced, Exposing Hierarchies of Hospitality through the Experience of the Roma People.
Thank you so much, Taras. It's so wonderful to be here and quite an honor to be asked to share in this context. So I look forward to sharing, and I look forward to our discussion afterwards with your questions. I'm going to share my screen. Great. Well, this is just a side note. I got up early to hear Dr. Hansel's lecture because he is my old professor from Fuller Seminary. And I took one class from him, and then I took another class from him, and then I took another class from him, and there was a little group of us that sort of followed him around with his classes because his teaching was just so provocative and so wonderful to get other perspectives rather than, as he was mentioning, just the Western perspective. So that was really fun to hear him again. And this whole discussion of expat versus migrant, that's an interesting one because I've been living in Croatia for about 14 years. And you do think of yourself, am I a migrant? Am I an expat there? Am I a missionary? You know, all these titles, they all have significance in these sorts of discussions. So I am from the US originally, but as I said, I've been living in Croatia for quite some time and traveling, not just in Croatia, but in Southeastern Europe for my research purposes. And I want to make a couple of caveats before I start. First of all, my positionality in this lecture. I'm going to be mentioning some sensitive topics, some painful topics, the Ukraine war and the war in Ukraine and I want to say that I'm not trying to compare experiences of suffering because you can't really do that. I'm not advocating that one group of people is suffering more than the other. My point is merely to bring into the foreground the experience of a group of people that often doesn't make it into the history books, or if they do make it into the history books, it's not from their own words and conceptualizations of an experience. So obviously, being from America, a migrant into Croatia, I am not Roma myself, but I work alongside of Roma friends and partners, and as much as possible, try to understand their experience from their point of view. And that's what I was trying to do with my PhD. Also, a caveat about the word Roma and what that means, I'll discuss that later. But I will use the word when it's historically needed, gypsy, which I recognize in many contexts can be derogatory, although not all contexts. There are some groups that very proudly call themselves gypsies, but when we're getting into World War II and that kind of thing, and in quotes, then I use the word gypsy in that context. Okay, so First part of my lecture, I just want to do sort of historical snapshots of the Roma experience as a refugee, migrant, or displaced person. The second part, and of course, the history is vast, but I'm just going to take little bits and pieces just to give us an idea. The second part, I want to think about how we're conceptualizing these issues. So problematizing the problem. And when I mean problem in quotes, why the Roma are treated this way in times of crises, not even just in times of crises, but particularly in times of crises, war, pandemic, whatever. And looking at our methodologies and Roma identity and this kind of ongoing creation of the other that is positioned against whoever we are. And then the third part, I want to reverse the camera because what that says, it's not so much what it says about the Roma, but what it says about us as individuals, as communities, as societies, as nation states, and as Christians of how we think about these issues. And then finally, I want to just leave some words about hospitality. I know that I unfortunately missed the lecture on theology of hospitality, which I would have loved to have heard. So I'm not going to go too much into that because you've already had a likely a robust theology of hospitality. So the invasion of Ukraine in 2022 caused the largest flow of refugees and displaced people since World War II. We know this. Thousands and eventually millions became displaced internally, inside and outside the country. But not necessarily everyone escaping the horrors of war were equally welcomed. Gradually, reports were released that there were unequal treatment of the Ukrainian Roma refugees, which emerged from Slovakia, Hungary, Moldova, Czech Republic, and Poland, just to mention a few. I like titles of articles or reports, even as a way to think about or analyze what's been going on. So here is one: Ukrainian Roma refugees face discrimination throughout Europe. In European host countries, there have been problems with housing, education, and employment and healthcare for Roma, although ethnic Ukrainians have also faced problems, for example, finding suitable housing. An ERGO, which is the European Roma Grassroots Organization 2022 report, found that 48% of 60 respondents reported observing discrimination related to renting housing in Poland. And then a 2025 Migration Policy Institute article cites numerous reasons for this, one being a significant lack of documents. There was an estimation that 10 to 12% of Roma in Ukraine lacked citizenship papers. So in 2022, I interviewed a Christian Roma lawyer in Moldova who was very active with the incoming wave of refugees. And she herself had been interviewing and trying to help these refugees. And she estimated that at that point, 70% of the Roma refugees coming into Moldova had no passport, although some had a birth certificate. So this meant a lot of issues, even more issues you would face than if you had documents. For example, even some simple things as in free transportation to the embassy were available to refugees from Ukraine, but you had to have papers to prove it. And then they would wait in lines for 2 to 3 weeks. And then when they get to the front of the line, the embassy says, we cannot document you because you never had any documentation. This is not an uncommon problem in other wars and conflicts throughout European history. But also, unequal treatment impacts how the Roma were viewed or categorized. In the Czech Republic, according to the Commission's Security and Cooperation in Europe report, politicians accuse Roma refugees of various things, such as coming from Hungary and not Ukraine to claim state benefits, of being social tourists, or merely economic migrants. And again, that's something you hear in other conflicts and wars categorizing them in a different way rather than refugee or asylum seeker. But the EU Parliament tried to address these issues. Quote, after the invasion, the European Parliament passed a resolution calling for, among other steps, member states to take effective measures against segregation of intra-EU Roma migrants and refugees from Ukraine and protect them against unlawful expulsions and discrimination in access to essential services. Well, I will say that Roma activists and NGOs, as well as Roma Christians, Roma churches, and non-Roma churches, missions and networks jumped into this gap and really worked tirelessly to advocate and help the Roma refugees. Roma Networks, which is a grassroots organization, was having meetings and trying to think how they could help the Roma refugees. And I know the mission arm of Light and Life, the French Roma, GATEF, they were sending aid into Ukraine and also Russia to Roma communities there. So they've been prominent, religious organizations as well as Roma activists have been prominent actors in organizing the aid response. But it wasn't just outside Ukraine. There are also problems with IDPs within Ukraine. There was a Roma couple who lived in Zaporizhzhia, and they have an NGO and they try to help protect Roma rights. And they said before the war, the Roma were very well integrated into their city. But then most of those Roma left during the war, and thousands of IDPs, not just Roma, came into their city. And they described that the Roma had greater difficulty securing housing in the city, and sometimes they would find them living in the forest with cellophane over trees as their only protection. Many volunteers tried to treat them equally, but other IDPs didn't actually want to be housed near Roma families, which was also a problem in other locations. And this couple said in the interview, for me, this became a big question. Why did people who had experienced the horrors of war themselves not want to accept Roma families who had gone through the same horrors? Why did these prejudices arise? War is not the time when stereotypes should be defining. It's a very potent question. And although often it seems that war brings out the best and the worst in people or other conflicts, and definitely you have so many stories of self-sacrifice and service and heroism, it can also bring out these worse latent prejudices and racism that are just sometimes under the surface and sometimes just resting on top of the surface. In fact, this is nothing new for the Roma, this kind of treatment in times of war or conflict. There are historical examples of migration of Roma from Central and Eastern Europe in the late 80s, early 90s, which caused panic in the media and from the public, from certain Western destination countries. And Roma had difficulty in recognition in refugees and as being recognized as refugees in other situations. So we're just going to look at a couple of those. One of the biggest, of course, being post-World War II. And again, here's another article written about this subject. And I like the title, Strangers in Their Own Land, because that is a phenomenon that has happened to the Roma in different times of war. You could say probably Ukraine, you could say Croatia, Serbia, Germany. In fact, this same title, there was an article in 2017 in the conflict in Eastern Ukraine where they used the same title to describe Roma IDPs within Ukraine that were having difficulty accessing services and help. So Romani groups suffered alongside of all others through Europe in the 1930s and 40s as the only other ethnic group alongside the Jews who were subject to the Nuremberg laws and slated for the final solution. Accurate statistics, and this is a big problem when you're talking about the Roma, they're lacking regarding the total number of Roma killed during World War II, but Scholars usually put it between 200,000, 500,000, although some scholars go much higher. Between 50 and 90% of Roma groups living in Germany, Austria, Czech lands, Croatia, Netherlands, the Baltic states, and some parts of the Soviet Union were essentially wiped out, while those in Serbia, Hungary, and Poland, amongst others, were less. The fascist independent state of Croatia sent most of Croatia's Roma, as well as Roma from other parts of Yugoslavia, to the concentration camp Jasenovac. And they were also held in a special section at Auschwitz-Birkenau and were of very special interest for Josef Mengel's experiments, but also used, of course, for medical experiments at other camps. But according to Rosenhoff, only a fraction of the Roma genocide victims died in Auschwitz. On the Eastern Front and in occupied Poland and the Soviet Union, gypsies were hunted down and massacred by death squads that accompanied the German armies, or alongside the Jews, they fell victim to mass killings. For example, in Kiev, several hundred Roma died at the notorious massacre site of Babi Yar. Not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. But more crucial for our discussion is what happened after the war. Well, in May of 1949, the International Refugee Organization, the IRO, met to decide who among the millions displaced after World War II would receive help to rebuild their lives. And the subject of gypsies came up. And a Polish lawyer at the table argued that they were professional wanderers traveling for economic reasons and could not be categorized as displaced. How could a nomad be a refugee? Didn't add up. But he did acknowledge that they were victims of the Nazis as they had been in the camps. Now, for the IRO, refugees, aside from Jews or Spanish Republicans, they had to prove they had reasons to fear persecution if they were to return to their home. And at that time, in their provisions, there was no special case for the Roma, Sinti, or Gypsies. But not everybody at the table at that moment agreed with the lawyer's thinking. Another person rejected this sort of collective way of defining the status of the Roma in regards to their status in the war, and argued for more of a individual rights focus, that each case be assessed case by case. Now, this had great potential for the Roma, since they had not at that point been mentioned in any of the minority protection treaties in European states. So this was a brief period in history, about 5 years, half a decade, under the IRO, that the Roma had valid claims for their persecution, and they were given help and services on that basis. In the research, saying that the title gypsy actually had more advantages than disadvantages under the IRO. And this time in history, of course, also showcases the resilience and agency of these Roma survivors, shaping their identity and working around discriminatory practices, even sometimes using contradictory state laws to their advantage. Unfortunately, this golden period was short-lived. As the 1950s went along in Germany, states began reverting to pre-war bureaucratic methods of handling the Roma. And this actually differed from country to country. There's no one central narrative. In Germany, in 1959, there was a rise of quote-unquote gypsy panic of an invasion, which led to attempts to deport large numbers back to their Eastern European states. Now, for the word, they created gypsy as its own category, so they were not German, Polish refugees, escapees, defectors. And in one scholar, Jaskowitz, Polish scholar, quote, "It was defined by a form of mobility, detaching them from any political commitments. From displaced persons, they had been under the IRO into a separate category of opportunistic migrants without claim to rights or refuge." So again, attaching an identity title with this idea of being a nomad or in constant mobility so that they're seen as these eternal wanderers. Now, this sort of all came to a head in this train incident in February 1959. There was this last mass resettlement of ethnic Germans from Poland, a large train coming with them. And at the station, there was a lot of media, there were people to welcome them, and it was going to be this big celebration. Well, the last 3 cars on the train were filled with Romani. And before the train got to the station, it stopped, and those 3 cars were disconnected, and then the train kept going. Well, the Romani quickly realized what was going on and started this mass panic, realized that they were not still attached to the main part of the train. In fact, the German authorities were planning on sending them back to the Soviet zone. So they started escaping the trains, handing children and babies through the windows and running. And it turned into this huge fiasco. And of course, the media was there, so there was no denying what was going on. Eventually, the German authorities rounded them up and housed them in Red Cross centers, and they did not send them back because of the spotlight that was on them at that time, and they eventually resettled them in Germany. So in fact, Michael Stewart calls the mid-20th persecution of Roma communities in Europe as an invisible genocide, as states considered what to do with their, and they even called it this, gypsy problem. Family systems and communities had been wiped out and survivors were traumatized, but for many years, their suffering was minimized, downplayed, or even denied, while other victims were highlighted. In some states, the narrative was that Roma suffered because of their criminality or being asocials, rather than the persecution being race-based. And this allowed a denial of compensation for the suffering. We see the prejudice in certain anecdotal stories. For example, in what used to be known as Czechoslovakia in 1945, 5 local mayors protested the return of their Romani, saying the suffering didn't appear to have changed them for the better. They were, quote, work shy, thieving, etc. And so they recommended resettling the survivors in a border area, quote, where they could be set to work under surveillance. Many Jews and other foreigners went through refugee centers and displaced person camps run by the Allies and United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation. But Romani survivors were not necessarily displaced in a legal or geographic sense. Most Romani survivors in Germany were native of Germany or Austrian or Czech territories that became part of the Reich. So before the war, some had been questioned of their citizenship and they became stateless after the war. And although they qualified as refugees, they would have to fight to get back their citizenship rights. The same thing happened in Italy. Italian governments denied their existence, also viewing them as foreigners. So they were caught up in the complexity of border shifts and negotiations of citizenships. And again, this is a common theme. This also happened when Yugoslavia fell apart. Many survivors turned to emigration as a way to start their lives over. But this was less an option for Romani survivors, although they did have family networks already in South America, North America. But sometimes they were turned away from the IRO and other agencies as undesirables. And there was no Romani equivalent to the international Jewish organizations that could support and advocate for and sponsor survivors. However, it was these experiences of war and displacement that were critical in fostering the international Roma civic movements. And in Germany in the 1980s, a new generation of Romani Germans began to advocate for the acknowledgement of the genocide, and this began a movement of international rights groups towards this end. So as Donert says in 2022, Roma survivors, quote, Roma survivors in post-war Europe were not simply victims, in other words, but rather historical actors whose Romani identities and experiences of persecution as gypsies were always entangled with other forms of national, social, and family belonging. Well, let's move on to in the 80s and 90s, beginning in the late 80s and 90s, migration from Central and Eastern Europe increased significantly. And after the fall of communism in Eastern Europe, there was massive unemployment among the Roma. And there were migration, because of that, there was migration from east to west. Now, in the West and in host countries, this was often perceived as a threat to social cohesion and security, particularly due to the large number of Roma from Poland, Czechia, Slovakia, Yugoslavia, and Romania participating in these movements in those decades. So, for example, as a result, the German government refused to grant asylum and consequently started deporting groups of Roma back to their countries of origin. Now, I want to look at a specific case in the Romani asylum seekers in the UK. At this time, around 1,000 Czech and Slovak Romani sought asylum in Dover between February 1st and January 1998 because of the anti-Romani citizenship laws in the countries, discrimination and racism, and local authority indifference. And this is coming from an article that critically looked at the media, how the media portrayed this wave of asylum seekers from Czech and Slovakia. So the general public really didn't really know, and this is also a common phenomenon, didn't really know what was going on and who were these Romani, their culture, their customs, why did they leave? Very complicated reasons, as usually is the case. But they didn't really, there was no attempt in the media basically to understand the position of these Roma asylum seekers. And here are some of the media titles. Gypsies were gold diggers searching for an easy life. They should be kicked out of Britain. Their status as political refugees was both cynical and bogus. Cuckoos in the nest, purely economic refugees, mere economic migrants rather than real refugees. And again, this contrast of real refugee as opposed to not a real refugee. A calculated abuse of our hospitality, who intentionally come over here to take our money. So these are all actually, these two scholars pulled these phrases out of these publications. And then contrasting them with how the readers should see themselves. And this is very interesting. The readers are enticed to reconstitute their own subject positions as generous, tolerant, and enduring members of an imagined British community marked by its collective hospitality, egalitarian resource distribution, and democratic way of life. From this standpoint, gypsiness may be recognized not only by its difference from Britishness, but as a serious and dangerous threat to the existing social order. So that is this othering, the eternal othering, that there is something about this group that is a threat to the existing social order. Moving on to former Yugoslavia, the wars, which I'm including the war in Kosovo in this time frame. Julia Sardulic, in her research, classifies three patterns of how the Roma were viewed. First is a buffer zone and collateral damage between two fires. Number two, unrecognized and invisible victims and fighters, because certainly many Roma fought in the wars. And yet I know of some that never received recognition or benefits of this. And they really suffered during the war, but their stories really have not been told. There was one book written by a Roma. I think he was a former soldier, or yeah, he wrote about the Roma experience. I did some interviews, but other than that, it's not in the main narratives of the war. It's completely ignored, the Roma experience. Um, so then you are an invisible victim. Or number three, perceived by local population as siding with the enemy, internal traitors. So in my research I did among Roma who lived in the occupied territory of Baranja, Croatia, um, some fled with the Croatians because most of the Croatians fled once the occupiers came in, but others lacked the means to flee, or others thought, well, it's going to be over soon, or, we're not really in this conflict. So we will just kind of bunker down here. But actually, it went on for many years. The Serbian forces were over there for a number of years. So they were squeezed between fires. They were forced to be on that side, according to some of my informants, under threat of violence. And then when the Croatians came back in 1998, after the territory was peacefully ceded back, there was this outbreak of anti-Roma violence because they were accused of stealing people's homes and being traitors. Number of Roma left in 1999, both because the hostility toward them and because they couldn't find jobs. And when I was interviewing the Roma mayor, he told me, although he said, make sure you don't mention my name or let this get out, but a Croatian businessman had said to him in those days, we will get rid of the Roma by not hiring them. So another challenge after the war was the difficulty many Roma had in obtaining citizenship. And as same thing that happened in Germany, in accessing their equal rights as a state citizen, because there had been some internal migrations within Yugoslavia based on their trades, and then they may have ended up in a different state than they had their roots once Yugoslavia dissolved. So it complicated matters. And this happened this is one example of an individual I know. He was born in Croatia, lived his whole life in Croatia. And he missed his chance when they were just forming the Croatian state to get his papers because of family issues he was having. And so then after that, in the chaos of post-war, he was a foreigner in his own country. And in fact, he was put in jail for 10 days because he didn't have his right papers. And he was told to go to Serbia to get his papers. Well, but he had never had papers in Serbia. So when he went to Serbia, they told him, why are you here to get papers? You didn't live here. So anyway, it was complicated. And he first had to get Serbian citizenship and then apply to Croatian citizenship through a green card process. And he didn't end up getting Croatian citizenship until 2014. So all this time, post-war, he is living as a foreigner in his own country. And the final example I want to talk about is displaced from the war in Kosovo. This 600 members of the Roma, Ashkali, and Balkan Egyptian families displaced during the Kosovo conflict. And they were put in these camps near this closed mine, lead and different minerals, close to a lead smelter. And there were pools of waste where they were put. Well, shortly after they were put there were also UN workers there, and they did blood tests and determined that their levels of lead in their bodies were way too high. So they quickly moved the UN workers out of there. Unfortunately, they did not move these other communities out. And so they had over a decade of exposure with many horrible health effects. And even though there were activist groups and things trying to raise awareness, unfortunately, they weren't moved out until much later. And in 2010, the protection officer of the chief of mission in the UNHCR said that it was only supposed to be an emergency temporary solution, although in my opinion, this is a very weak response. They were unable to find another site because neither the Albanians nor the Serbs want them, nor did any other country offer assistance. And in fact, when they set up a fund to help recompense some of the victims, nobody contributed. No countries contributed. And this, of course, also their quality of life, not just their health, but their livelihood, access to social welfare, all these kinds of things. So going back to the experiences of Ukrainian Roma in light of some of these historical snapshots, it again brings to the surface these issues of race and persistence of anti-Roma racism in contemporary societies. In fact, one scholar says that anti-Gypsyism or Romophobia, it's the last acceptable form of racism, meaning that countries can get away with it and individuals can get away with it. But not just that, looking at the unequal opportunities, possibilities, and resources within the citizenship framework. These acts of citizenship take place in a broader transnational space and across complex hierarchies of race, class, and gender. And this is moving us on to our next section, which I realize I've taken up a bit of time in the first section, but problematizing the problem. How are we to think about these issues if we kind of step back from the immediate experiences of the people and what's happened in historical record? How do we think about the issue that all this perpetual anti-Gypsyism, Romophobia that flares up when there are wars and stressors and conflicts? Well, Dorothea Nage, in her 2016 article on migration and methodologies, she looks at this issue stepping back and thinking about through what methodology are we thinking about these issues? And of course, she's thinking about methodology as the total number of assumptions that undergird any study, our own ways of interpreting and knowing the world. And some of these are articulated and some of them are unarticulated. And of course, it's always helpful in scholarly research to try to articulate that which is assumed or unarticulated. So she introduces this concept, well, it's not her concept, but reflects on this concept of methodological nationalism, which Glick-Schiller defines as ideological viewpoint that studies social processes and historical processes as if they are contained in a nation state. So society, in other words, society equals nation state. Also, it's connected to land and territory. So nation, ethnicity, citizenship, always being connected to land and owned territory. And that's a methodological nationalism. Nation states are conflated with societies, and the members of these states are assumed to share a common history and set of values, norms, social customs, and institutions. And of course, the problem is with that is that there could be any number of groups in a given nation state that have their own history, set of values, norms, and social customs. But if they're excluded from the common history, or they are meant to be, the boundaries is put, well, you're there, we're here. That's what has happened many times to the Roma. And Glick-Schiller calls it that while migration scholars are engaged in the study of globalization phenomena, in the study of the flow, mobility, and motion of people and materials worldwide, they continue to use, quote, concepts of society and culture that reflect essentialist and racialized concepts of nation. So Dorothea Nage, she talks about how this works in two directions. Larger groups creating smaller groups of identification. For example, she uses the example of Asian American, and people may use different parts of that identity. You know, what kind of Asia? If it's someone from Hong Kong, do they say Hong Kong or in China in certain contexts. And then it also creates smaller groups that is between ethnicity and nationalism, with the idea that the nation state is all about making boundaries of who belong and who doesn't belong. So she's not saying that ethnicity and national belonging in nation states are not important in identity formation, nor as a method of analysis. But she's calling attention to the danger that these identity markers, she calls it creating competitive social fields of power, which allows people through politics to draw these boundary markers with the implication that we are better than those others, and we are the owners of this land, and you are strangers on this land. It also it also means recognizing that when you're talking about migration, refugees, and the displaced, it's a reckoning of who is the other, and other is big capital O, with the idea that people who are not like us and maybe should be viewed with suspicion or even as a threat to the social order. So using only this lens, the Roma often do not make out well, as history shows us, because the Roma have often been thrown into these states of in-betweenness in various state formations, conflicts, wars. And Startelish says that the Roma minorities challenge this narrative, not just her, but others, challenge this narrative of the homogenous state. And they often end up as collateral damage because of this idea of being in between these boundary markers. So if we just go back quickly to this post-World War II construction for the refugees administrators, as they were negotiating these categories of nationalism, refugees, and they're confronted with the gypsies. Okay, they're those coming from Czechoslovakia were neither Czech nor Slovak nor German, those who fled from different borderlands that were disputed between Italy and Yugoslavia, didn't appear to belong to any of the major ethnic groups of the area, and lacked claims to the land. Others were German speakers born in Germany, of parents born in Germany, yet then they were stateless. So in this world seeking to reconstruct stable national order, this was a problem. They existed beyond this matrix defining national belonging and uprootedness. So in thinking about this theologically and missiologically, Nagy challenges thinking about migration in terms of how an ethnic group maintains its identity, rather looking at how ethnic groups are being shaped, transformed, and constructed. So she's saying that is a more useful, in thinking about this theologically and missiologically, that is a more useful and helpful and less entrapping way of analyzing the situation, using a multidisciplinary lens of sociology, anthropology, theology, looking at it from different discipline lens. And this is essential when we are thinking about the Roma, because the formation of Roma identity in national and transnational spaces is very complex, as you might have already realized. And their identity through history as a European minority, part of the European space and history. I mean, in one sense, it's not complex at all. You go to a community or an individual, they say we are Roma, or they say we are not Roma, and that's very simple. But it's when these self-appellations intersect with the majority society, or how the majority will name them, or political frameworks, transnational policies, it becomes quite complex. And then in politics, it can be used as a word tied to various meanings to be used for some agendas. And this is just one simple example. When I was with the community in Serbia, who by the Serbians are called Roma, and this lady was accepting that title, and then at one point she got frustrated and annoyed and said, actually, we're not Roma. We don't speak Romani. we speak this old Romanian, you know, and scholars would call that community Bayash, but she called herself Romanian. Well, the Romanians would say, no, they're not Romanian. So you see the complexities of these issues. So in a 2025 article entitled The Political Construction of Roma Population Estimates, Martin Kovács argued that Roma identity had to be politicized in order to justify EU policy. In fact, it was after these migration waves after the fall of communism in 1989 where the EU got involved and started forming this EU policy of Roma integration in EU states so that likely the Roma would stay in their home state. Yet, one of the rights of living in the EU is mobility. So part of that problem is that social policy became racialized. And they use, in EU discourse, they use Roma to be this sort of umbrella term over a wide diversity of groups and communities that may or may not self-identify as Roma. And what happens with this, with social policy being constructed with outside ascribed identity, then often the word Roma becomes synonymous with poor or marginalized, which then leads to further discrimination. Kovács says, quote, "It may seem bizarre that public institutions committed to upholding human rights could construct a political discourse that, in the context of widespread prejudice and discrimination, racializes social policy and attributes low-status ethnic identity that puts poor, marginalized citizens at risk of discrimination." So there's a lot of conflicting ideas which undergird European policies about the Roma. So there's this rigid understanding and definition of Roma identity. And then there's the wide diversity of national approaches toward the Roma and the diversity of the Roma groups themselves. And in terms of migration or displacement, the way the Roma are imagined and conceptualized is often directly related to how they are viewed in terms of their mobility, whether it be forced or voluntary. If they're viewed as European, outsiders, nomads, or wanderers, they become the other, and this gives a certain permissiveness to their unequal treatment. In the words of Vera Messing, when nationalisms arise, it's usually not good for the Roma. All of a sudden, they are again viewed as a stranger or foreigner. In fact, as Roma often become a target in policies, actions, or discourses. And she interrogated these complex concepts of both Roma and migrant, and together, Roma migrant, and concludes that the meaning is less about actual people who are Roma and migrant and more about society's understanding of what this means for EU politics and policies. And part of this othering is this narrative of Roma as perpetual nomads, wanderers, free spirits, etc. Bernard Rark says that as long as these exclusions within European history and if they're not included in peacemaking and reconstruction keep happening, the continent's self-understanding will remain fatally flawed. So now we're turning a little more in this last section to looking not at how the Roma groups are treated, but what does that say about our societies, our politics, and psychology? So I call this reversing the camera, the study of us in hospitality hierarchies. The church's hospitable practice, and I heard Dr. Hansels talk about this a little bit, to understand our theology, to look at our practices, to understand our theology, because practice and attitudes reveal our theology way more than our spoken words. In the words of James K. Smith, you are what you love because you live toward what you want. So our living, the ways of living, reveals what we love and what we want. I want to just quickly go to scripture, and this is not meant to be a systematic look at this issue, but looking at hierarchies of hospitality in terms of how Jesus critiqued those. And we have many examples of this. And I want to look at the table as the stage to demonstrate God's hospitality, because that is such a big theme in the New Testament, of certainly, of the hospitality of God. And so we have questions, why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? Because again, the table is this intimate space where you're reclining and you're with people and you're listening and you're in their intimate space. So this says a lot about God's hospitality. And then we have examples in Luke of Jesus talking about, don't invite the people that you would want to invite, because that's really the case. The people we want to invite creates these hierarchies of hospitality. They're the people we feel comfortable with already. They're the people that make us feel good. But he talks about blessing, that you will be blessed to bring down these hierarchies of hospitality. And of course, there's many other examples in Jesus's modeling of breaking down these barriers and these hierarchies of hospitality. Well, let's go quickly into the early church. And we have this story of people fearing to be with Paul because he'd been this killer of Christians. And so I just want to say that fear as a barrier, in that case, it was overcome by Holy Spirit guidance, but also their obedience, and they're willing to step out and overcome that fear of the other. In Galatians 2, we have the story of Peter, who was having table fellowship with Gentiles, but then became afraid of what this new group of Jews would say. And so he stepped back and created a barrier there. And Paul took him to task. And he related it to being a gospel issue, because, of course, the gospel has vertical and horizontal implications in relationships. So he was not acting in truth of the gospel, that this idea of relationality and generous hospitality and table fellowship with all is key to an expression of the gospel. So relinquishing religious power and reputation to manifest God's hospitality. Then we have another example in Philemon, with Philemon being sent back as a slave, and Paul saying, welcome him as you would welcome me. He's asking them to relinquish social power to manifest God's order of relationship. So these are just a few examples. And then I just want to mention this idea of when we're thinking about hierarchies of hospitalities, the central piece of this is first recognition. And this is part of listening to stories of people, not seeing them as a people group, but listening to individual stories and recognizing their human experience. But also, it's very much intertwined with justice. That, in fact, Tisha Rajendra says that justice should be the central concept rather than hospitality. I say they're intertwined, but it has to have, as Steve Bevan says, a strong commitment to justice. And a generous hospitality contests these social hierarchies. Otherwise, it just affirms the current ones. If we are not being asked, so to speak, if the church is not being asked, why are you eating with those people? Or why are you helping those people? Then perhaps we are just reinforcing what already exists. And then finally, I'll revisit this in a second, the power of being the host. So a just hospitality as both discipleship practice and prophetic mission. And in this, to ask ourselves, where is the church's mission of hospitality? Reversing the camera. Although new kinship relationships, we know this, are created of this new familiar relationship with God, which should transcend social and cultural relationships, nonetheless, they are still lived out within the complicated social and cultural context. And that's why there's these tensions. And that's why we need other ways of analyzing other than this methodological nationalism or one discipline. And what does our practice of generous hospitality or non-generous hospitality reveal about our theology and missiology? In what ways are we captive to our socio-political means of analyzing our situations? Are we the power brokers or the powerless, or are we caught in multiple tensions between the poles? James K. Smith said that discipleship is not teaching us how to love, but reforming our love towards God's kingdom. Thus, I would say practicing this just hospitality reforms our love into the kinds of relationships that fit and flourish in the kingdom. And this is key because most of the time our loves are constantly being pulled to be formed in a different way, according to what is our cultural values. And this, of course, subverts and challenges the existing racisms and social hierarchies. So I want to give the final word to the Roma, the power of being the host. This was from the 2015 refugee crisis from the Middle East and Syria. And Roma Christians stepped up into that host position to serve those refugees, saying, you know, we understand what they might be feeling. We understand maybe the rejection that they feel when they come into these European countries. And this is a important place of redeeming power to be the host and to welcome those refugees. And final word from Roma traveler himself, Stephen Horn, and he's theologizing on these issues. And he says, for gypsies and travelers, embodying the concept of sojourner is often without choice, being forced to perpetually occupy the social and religious position of outsider, of alien, and of stranger in the land. Permanent impermanence thus becomes the designated mode of everything. But the blessing dwells in the uncertainty. And as I teach mission, and blessing is a big motif, starting from the very beginning, going through Abraham and the blessing, and how we are both recipients of the blessing, and the blessing goes through us to other people. And the question is, do we understand how the blessing, how Roma Christians exhibit the blessing, and are we open to receiving the blessing from these Roma communities as being from other nationalities and ethnicities? So thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Dr. Melody, do you hear me well?
Yes, I do.
Wi-Fi doesn't work, so I switched to mobile internet. Okay, as I have been listening to your presentation, I have two questions, and then we will switch to the questions from other participants. The first question is, let me put it in chat too. To what extent can just hospitality function as a prophetic ecclesial response without first confronting and repenting of the church historical complicity in creating or sustaining hierarchies of exclusion? And I mean, should we speak about the need for structural and theological repentance, like metanoia first, not, I mean, evangelical repentance, just to be baptized. So before any meaningful change can occur. So whether hospitality alone is enough without this.
Oh, can you hear me? Okay. Yes, this is an excellent point, that there does need to be a significant amount of repentance. And part of that is coming to terms with the history, which many people and even countries are still unwilling to do. If we look at the situation in Romania, for example, and coming to terms with their history of slavery of the Roma, has a long ways to go. So that is a critical piece. And you see it in other places, this idea that when South Africa had a truth commission, it would be hard to do in this case because the experiences are so varied. But that's something I think the church can pray for, is this spirit of recognition of how they have excluded the Roma and participated in state practices of exclusion and non-recognition. And I really think that's, something that comes from the Holy Spirit, is that awareness and recognition and deep repentance, which then this idea of prophetic justice, just hospitality, that becomes truly prophetic for countries that so often other the Roma populations. And this has such tremendous theological potential. And I think, there's been quite a few measures taken in the last decade or so of trying to build these bridges of reconciliation. But yeah, I really did think a lot about bringing in the theme of reconciliation into this talk as well, because that is a key component, but there was just too much. I didn't have enough time. But thank you for your question.
Yeah, thank you. So I will keep the second, and we see if there is time for that. A question from Alexander Gaichenko. I recall that while I was a child, I was from time to time warned to beware of gypsies, Roma, because they're still kids. So was my childhood too. That was quite frightening for me as a child. I understand that such stereotypes are deeply engraved in popular mentality, and these stereotypes are being transmitted uncritically. At the same time, it is hard to fight with cultural stereotypes because they are not rational, but rather irrational. So the question, what a possible strategy for changing such stereotypes could be?
I think the best thing is having a relationship with an actual Roma person. That is what transforms those stereotypes, those prejudices, and to see, oh, wow, not only they're a person, but I really like this person, and they really contribute a lot to my life. And I've heard multiple testimonies of God calling non-Roma to work with Roma who had these prejudices within their hearts, and they melted away, after forming relationships. And really, you could say with God being the great multitasker in mission, probably it was more for the person with the prejudice why they God called them to work with the Roma, rather than for the Roma, because of those kinds of prejudice and racism and stereotypes, which we all have, in the graciousness of the Holy Spirit to reveal those things to us. But they are such a barrier to our unity in Christ and the church and God's mission. And I don't know what the order of question is, but I see that my friend Igor is here. He is a Roma from Brazil. So I welcome his comments and questions if he would like to.
Yeah, thank you. We have another question from Nishat Isaac Chandy. Thank you very much for the exhaustive historical analysis and enlightening missional dimension of just hospitality in relation to the Roma people. But how do you feel the churches have been evolving their missional concerns and sensitivity to the Roma people? Also, why the need for a just hospitality? Do you sense an injustice in it at all?
Well, I guess it depends how you define hospitality, but I think because human tendency with hospitality I mean, even Jesus noted this, when he said, don't invite your friends and family and the people, that you feel most comfortable with. That's human nature, obviously. But he said, the blessing is to invite the other, invite the people that you're not sure about, or now, of course, Christine Pohl, in her wonderful book on hospitality, she says this has to be balanced with other things, thinking about what's realistic and not. But the point is that attaching the word just to hospitality helps us think about that not all hospitality is given equally. And to think about just God's justice in a way of part of God's justice is relational and creating that relational shalom, that restoring relationships between different peoples as well as between people and God. So I think it helps us, it distinguishes a different angle of how we think about hospitality and what hospitality can fall into if we're not careful, which is these hierarchies of really welcoming some people, but then closing the door to others out of distrust or fear or prejudice or whatnot. And the first part of the question, I'm not sure I heard something about churches, how churches are responding, or could you repeat that?
Yeah, just a second. Yeah, how do you feel the churches have been evolving their missional concerns and sensitivity to the Roma people?
Okay, some have not at all, unfortunately. Some, maybe it's not racism, but it's paternalism toward the Roma. But there are groups that have really made bigger efforts to, I would say, not just include the Roma, but give them a voice and see them as part of European Christianity, for example. And that's more of awareness, for example, with Lausanne, which is a big international evangelical group, or European Evangelical European Alliance has made efforts to bring Roma voices into the pool. So there are shifts and changes, but part of that is because you have places, organizations like Roma networks that are advocating, that are putting people forward into those spaces to bring the attention and the problems to light.
Yeah, and speaking about just hospitality, so this is why we in Ukraine pray and request just peace. So not only peace, because if you speak only about peace, so you can request God and they will to reconcile, and then our problems on the earth will be resolved. So if it's not about just peace, so this is how I also view this idea of just hospitality. Another question from Alina Solnyshkina. What social projects carried out by churches for social adaptation of women from Roma communities? I know about School of Literacy and vocational trainings in Romania. It was very interesting for me. So are you aware of any other initiatives for social adaptation of women from Roma communities?
Yeah, not off the top of my head, but there are definitely Romani women who have created NGOs and groups, initiatives for Roma women. Less so in the Christian sphere, unfortunately. There, I would say this is really a neglected area that in my region, the Southeastern Europe, there's quite a lot of room to encourage and empower Roma women, Christian Roma women, to step forward in their giftings and in their leadership. So this is really an area that needs to be expanded and grown, but there are definitely initiatives out there targeted for Roma women by Roma women, among others.
Thank you. Then another question from Ilya Tsikaluk. What do you know about the spread of the gospel among immigrant Roma, particularly after 2022? What is the current voice of the church in Europe in maybe specific initiatives after
Well,
2022?
After 2022, okay. Well, there's quite a lot going on with migrant Roma from the east to the west. They've started a lot of churches. The Roma Bible School actually has a school among Roma migrants from Serbia in Germany, because, and the stories are very interesting. These now they're pastors, but they weren't. They came over to Germany from Serbia for a better life, and God sort of seized them up along the way, and now they see it as actually they're called into mission, and they've started these churches, they planted churches, and thinking about how to, it's primarily reaching their own group of Roma. And that is one thing that I've noticed. There's a number of, for example, immigrants from Bulgaria that have started churches, from Romania that have started churches all throughout Western Europe. And most of the time it's sort of focused on their own group of Roma because they have their own dialects and customs and specific culture and that kind of thing. But they are open to other groups, especially these particular groups from Southeastern Europe. They typically have a much wider lens for mission, and they feel that through them, God will use them to help re-evangelize European society. So these groups from Southeastern Europe, they're not just kind of focusing on their own Roma group, but their vision is much wider. But that's not the case for all the other Roma churches. And I haven't studied extensively outside of migrant churches from Southeastern Europe, so I can't speak too authoritatively on that.
Yeah, we still have a couple of minutes. So I have another question. To what extent does the church use of hospitality language risk becoming a theological instrument for maintaining control over inclusion rather than deconstructing power structures in ecclesiology? So it's whether hospitality is commonly practiced, so to what extent commonly, to what depths of practice.
I think that goes back to looking at who is omitted in our hospitality practices, and whose stories are not among us. And often I think looking at quote unquote sins of omission, we can see what's actually going on with our theology and our missiology and thinking about those kinds of things. So yeah, I absolutely think that we can grab onto this nice idea of hospitality as and make it as deep and complex or as shallow as we want to. And I think by only analyzing how we are interpreting that concept and how we are practicing that concept, and again, who is not at the table, that helps us analyze what is really going on here.
Yeah, it resonates for me also with, now we have a discussion, we have a research project with a couple of seminaries on theology of disability, and there is a question about inclusivity, even if it's a proper term. Do we include, or we serve to these people like objectifying them, or we want to see them serving with us? So we serve them as an object, and it's very convenient because there is always ones that need to be served that are in need, and we like feel better, or we are ready to reconstruct theology attitude, thinking to co-serve together. So.
And that's a really important point in this case too, and that's why I say I serve alongside of Roma Christians, because I'm not out in front, and I'm next to them, and I want them to lead, and I want to serve where I can. But there definitely still is, and I mentioned this, a huge issue with this other majority churches this kind of paternalism that, oh, look at that poor Roma community. Let's, let's go serve them. But they never move past this sort of like objectified, we're serving them, and never think about developing maybe friendships and relationships and, sitting in their kitchen table, drinking coffee with them and that type of thing, because the Roma are so highly relational. So that is a very important point that we think majority populations, whether it be in terms of disability or minority populations, um, reflect on ourselves and our own attitudes and thoughts about the other. Even though we might think, I mean, going back to that quote about the British Society and their perspective of those asylum seekers in 1997, thinking of themselves as democracy, hospitable, generous, all this kind of thing, but that actually didn't reflect reality.
Yeah, thank you, Melody. And we have two comments. One comment from Alex and another comment with a subsequent question. So the comment from Alex, just this week, the authorities in the UK have evicted travelers from Two Tree Island, the land opposite my home on Canvey Island, and placed concrete pillars to stop their return. The local social media has created an unkind vibe of traveling people being dirty and less than it's of note that both in 1997 and 2025, fresh prejudice in many forms and new Labour governments have been the political landscape. The same local politicians that are granting planning permission for thousands of brick-built homes are making life hard for nomadic people living a low impact of grid life. This is used with typed with a voice synthesizer. But,
That is, sorry, what did you say the last thing?
yeah, it was typed with a voice synthesizer.
Okay.
Yeah. So just a comment to your lecture. And another comment is with a question. Thank you so much, Melody. This is from Trevor Deck. Good to see you again. My wife and I were working with Roma in Bulgaria with Sil about 10 years ago when we met.
I remember
Glad
you,
to
Trevor.
see your
Yes.
valuable work here. Thank you. And then the question might be about the way Melody has seen languages used and the use of different languages play a part in just hospitality.
Yeah, that is a big question. Because, well, one exciting thing I will mention, there is a large translation project going on. And I think Trevor was involved with this in Bulgaria, but in Southeastern Europe in October, I think 4 dialects have been translated to the New Testament, Romani dialects. But yes, language is a huge thing because, Romani is not in Google Translate. And in so to speak, it's hard to learn that because you can't just like, oh, what does that word mean? And of course there are dictionaries created by Romani scholars and whatnot, but language is a central part of recognition as a people, and that is an issue which should be considered more, I think. In fact, it was interesting. I was in with the Roma Bible School. I was in Shutka, Macedonia. We had our school there, which is basically a Roma city. It's Roma run with mayor and police force and everything. And it was so fun to see the students who come from different parts, different countries, their first time there, and to hear they're saying, "Wow, I'm hearing my language in the grocery store," and it's so strange. They just couldn't get over this experience that we all take for granted of being in a situation where your language is the one spoken on the street. And that was a really interesting thing to witness.
Thank you, Melody, and dear participants. Do you have any other questions? Maybe Melody, your friend that you mentioned from Brazil, yeah? So
Yeah, I don't know if he's still on here,
if
if
he
he
has any
exited off.
comments or additional reflection.
I think he may have exited. Igor, are you still here?
Yeah, maybe.
He left.
Yeah. Okay, he
Yeah.
left.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Ksenia, I want to invite you for concluding announcements.
Yeah, I want to thank again to Dr. Melody Wachsmuth for this presentation. We received many comments, and I joined those comments because people shared that they were ignorant about this question, and I can say me too. So when we were looking for speakers, and one of our colleagues, she shared the publication that Melody did. And we thought that that's a person that we need to invite, because those things that we need to listen to, and we need then to change also our practice. So thank you also for this call to us as Ukrainians, because we are not also like the victims of this war. We do, but at the same time, we also share the responsibility for those who are struggling with us. So thank you for being with us, and we invite you for the next 5th day of the Summer School of Theology tomorrow.